Sometimes the walls we build to protect our hearts become the very prisons that keep love out. There are moments in life when everything we believe about ourselves gets challenged by someone who sees straight through to our soul. At Devil's Spur Ranch, Raina Caraway had one rule that never failed her. No man could break Stormfire, her wild stallion. Then a mysterious stranger rode in at dawn and did the impossible. He tamed the untamable horse with just a whisper, but when Raina looked into his eyes, she realized this wasn't just any cowboy. This was Colt Avery, a man she thought was dead. A legend who vanished years ago after a bounty went wrong. Now he was back, and he had secrets that could change everything. What did this cowboy know that others didn't? And could he tame more than just a wild horse? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The dust at Devil's Spur Ranch told stories older than memory, swirling in amber clouds that caught the morning light like whispered secrets. Raina Caraway stood at the weathered limestone marker, where her grandfather had once gathered his men, her boots planted firm against the earth that had shaped 3 generations of her family. The declaration stone, as the hands called it, bore the weight of countless announcements, births, deaths, celebrations, and challenges that had echoed across these wind-swept acres. At 28, Raina carried herself with the quiet authority of someone who had earned respect through calloused hands and steady resolve rather than inherited privilege. Her dark hair, always pulled back in a practical braid, caught copper highlights in the sun, and her green eyes held the kind of depth that came from watching horizons and reading weather patterns in cloud formations. She wore her father's old work shirt, sleeves rolled to her elbows, and jeans that had seen more honest labor than most men's Sunday clothes. The ranch stretched before her like a living canvas painted in browns and golds, 15,000 acres of rolling hills and canyon breaks that had been Caraway land since her great-grandfather claimed it during the cattle boom of 1882. Devil's Spur earned its name from the jagged rock formation that jutted skyward like Satan's own boot heel, visible from every corner of the property. Local folklore claimed it was cursed, but the Caraways had always found it luckier landmark that guided lost cattle home and warned of storms brewing beyond the distant mountains. In her father's office, tarnished silver spurs hung from a wooden peg beside the door, catching dust motes that danced in the afternoon light, streaming through windows that hadn't been cleaned in months. Thomas Caraway's spurs, polished smooth by decades of use, represented everything Raina had inherited: the weight of expectation, the burden of legacy, and the unspoken understanding that she would carry this land forward or die trying. She touched them sometimes when the loneliness pressed too heavy, feeling the cool metal and remembering the sound they made when he walked, the gentle jingle that meant safety and home. The ranch hands respected her because she had never asked them to do anything she wouldn't do herself. She rode fence lines in thunderstorms, pulled calves in the dead of winter, and worked cattle drives that lasted from dawn until the stars emerged. Miguel Santos, her foreman, had watched her grow from a stubborn girl who fell off horses into a woman who could gentle a spooked mare with nothing but patience and soft words. At 62, Miguel moved with the careful dignity of someone whose body bore the honest scars of ranch work, and his weathered face creased into familiar lines when he smiled. That stallion's gonna hurt someone serious one of these days. Miguel had warned her just yesterday, leaning against the corral fence and shaking his head as Stormfire paced the perimeter like a caged tornado. Maybe it's time to think about selling him to someone who's got the facilities for a horse that wild. Raina had fixed him with the look that meant the conversation was over. Stormfire stays, she'd said simply. This is his home. The black stallion had come to them 3 years ago, a yearling caught in a flash flood that had swept through Devil's Canyon during the worst spring storms anyone could remember. Raina found him trapped on a ledge, half drowned and fighting mad, his coat slick with mud and his eyes rolling white with terror. Most people would have left him for the buzzards, but something in his desperate struggle reminded her of herself, stubborn, proud, and refusing to quit, even when the odds seemed impossible. She'd spent weeks earning his trust, sitting by his stall with a book and a thermos of coffee, never approaching, never demanding, just being present until his curiosity overcame his fear. When he finally allowed her to touch his muzzle, she named him Stormfire for the lightning that seemed to crackle in his dark coat and the tempest that lived in his spirit. Now he stood 16 hands high, coal black from nose to tail, except for a single white star on his forehead, shaped like a lightning bolt. He moved like poetry written in muscle and bone, every step a declaration of wild freedom that no amount of training could completely domesticate. He would take grain from Rayna's hand and let her brush his coat until it gleamed like polished obsidian, but the moment any man approached with rope or saddle, he transformed into a force of nature that sent cowboys scrambling over fence rails. Tommy Rodriguez had lasted 8 seconds before Stormfire sent him flying into the water trough. Jake Morrison managed 12 seconds and walked away with a separated shoulder and a healthy respect for the power contained in that sleek black frame. Even Marcus Wheeler, the neighboring rancher, who had been trying to court Rayna for the better part of 2 years, had declined her challenge to try his hand with the stallion. "Some horses aren't meant to be ridden," Marcus had said, his pale blue eyes studying Stormfire with the careful assessment of a man who knew his limitations. "Maybe you should consider that wisdom applies to more than just horses." Marcus owned the adjacent Circle W Ranch, 5,000 acres of prime grazing land that his father had built into one of the most profitable operations in 3 counties. At 35, he was everything a sensible woman should want: financially secure, reliable, church-going, and handsome in the clean-cut way that mothers approved of. His sandy hair was always perfectly combed, his shirts pressed with military precision, and his boots polished to a mirror shine that never seemed to collect dust, no matter how long he spent in the saddle. He'd been persistent in his pursuit of Rayna, bringing her wildflowers in mason jars, helping with repairs after storms, and making sure everyone in town knew he considered her more than just a neighbor. But something about his calculated courtship felt like a business transaction rather than romance, and Rayna found herself making excuses to avoid the community dinners where he would appear at her elbow with a plate of food and conversation that felt rehearsed. The financial pressures that came with running Devil's Spur alone made Marcus's interest both flattering and complicated. Feed costs had risen 30% in 2 years, and the mortgage payments that had seemed manageable when cattle prices were high now stretched her budget thin. The bank president, Harold Ashworth, had been making increasingly frequent visits, his expressions growing more concerned each time he reviewed the ledgers that Rayna kept in her father's old desk. "Times are changing, Miss Carraway," he'd said during his last visit, adjusting his spectacles and frowning at columns of figures that never seemed to add up the way they should. "Maybe it's time to consider some of the offers you've been getting for portions of the property. Developments coming to this area whether we like it or not." The offers came regularly, now developers from back east who saw opportunity in the wide open spaces, investors who spoke of golf courses, and housing subdivisions where cattle currently grazed. Each manila envelope that arrived in her mailbox felt like an insult to everything her family had built, and she filed them in the trash can without opening them. Evening chores provided a rhythm that soothed the worries that came with sunset. Rayna moved through the barn with practiced efficiency, checking water troughs and distributing hay to horses that nickered soft greetings when they heard her footsteps. The familiar smells of leather and sweet feed, the comfortable sounds of horses settling for the night, the way golden light slanted through the open doors, these moments reminded her why she fought so hard to keep this place. Stormfire occupied the end stall, larger than the others, and reinforced with double rails after he'd kicked through the original boards during his first week at the ranch. He watched her approach with intelligent dark eyes that seemed to hold secrets, his ears pricked forward with interest rather than alarm. For her, he was gentle as a lamb, allowing her to run her hands along his sleek neck and check his hooves for stones or cuts. "What is it about you that scares them so much?" she murmured, scratching behind his ears, in the spot that made him lean into her touch like a giant cat. "You're all bluster and show when it comes right down to it." But even as she said the words, she knew they weren't entirely true. Stormfire contained a wildness that civilization couldn't touch, a spirit that belonged to open ranges and starlit skies rather than fenced paddocks and scheduled feeding times. He chose to be gentle with her, but that choice could change as quickly as mountain weather, and they both understood the delicate balance of their relationship. The other horse her father's aging, gelding buck, the dependable mares she used for working cattle, the young stock she trained and sold to neighboring ranchers all accepted their roles in the domestic order of ranch life. Stormfire remained apart, magnificent and untouchable, a reminder that some things in this world refuse to be tamed, no matter how much love and patience you offered them. As she latched his stall for the night, Raina found herself thinking about the conversation she'd overheard in town that afternoon. Two cowboys from the Double Bar Ranch had been discussing a stranger who'd been asking questions about horses and work opportunities. A man with pale eyes and calloused hands who spoke little but listened carefully to everything said around him. "Had the look of someone who'd seen too much," one had said, stirring sugar into his coffee and keeping his voice low. "The kind of man who carries his troubles in his back pocket and sleeps light." The description reminded her of stories her father used to tell about the old days, when men moved across the landscape like tumbleweeds, carrying their past behind them and their future ahead of them, never staying in one place long enough to put down roots or form attachments that could be used against them. Walking back to the house as stars began to emerge in the darkening sky, Raina couldn't shake the feeling that change was coming to Devil's Spur Ranch, whether she was ready for it or not. The evening breeze carried the scent of sage and distant rain, and somewhere in the hills, a coyote called out to the rising moon, with a voice that sounded like longing made audible. Inside the old ranch house, the silence felt heavier than usual. 3 bedrooms upstairs that hadn't been occupied in years, a dining room table that seated 8 but only ever held one place setting, a parlor with furniture that had been her grandmother's pride and joy, now covered with dust covers, like ghosts of better times. She heated up leftover stew and ate, standing at the kitchen counter, looking out the window toward the corral, where Stormfire stood silhouetted against the star-filled sky, like something carved from shadow and starlight. Tomorrow would bring the same routines, the same challenges, the same quiet satisfaction of work, well done. But tonight, for reasons she couldn't name, the familiar felt fragile, as if everything she'd built her life around balanced on the edge of transformation. Dawn came slowly to Devil's Spur Ranch, painting the eastern sky in shades of rose and gold that reminded Raina of her grandmother's china. She stood at the kitchen window with her first cup of coffee, watching the world wake up in the gentle way that only early risers ever witnessed. The air carried the promise of heat later, but for now it held the cool sweetness of night dew and sage blossoms. Movement on the horizon caught her attention, a lone rider approaching from the direction of the main road, moving with the unhurried pace of someone who had traveled far and wasn't in any particular rush to arrive. Even at distance, something about the figure struck her as different from the usual visitors to Devil's Spur. No urgency in his posture, no obvious purpose beyond forward motion, as if he were following some internal compass rather than directions to a specific destination. By the time she'd finished her coffee and pulled on her boots, the stranger had reached the outer fence line. Raina walked to the corral where Stormfire stood alert, his dark head raised and ears pricked toward the approaching rider, with the keen interest of a predator recognizing another apex creature. The stallion's muscles rippled beneath his coat as he moved to the fence, and she noticed he showed none of the aggressive posturing that usually accompanied the arrival of strangers. The man rode a dusty bay gelding that had seen better days, but moved with the steady gait of a horse accustomed to long miles and uncertain destinations. His coat was worn thin at the elbows, the color faded from black to charcoal gray, and his hat sat low over his brow, casting shadows that obscured his features. Everything about him suggested someone who preferred to move through the world without drawing attention, a man who had learned the value of anonymity. He dismounted near the declaration stone, where generations of Cowboys had made their announcements, his movements economical and practiced. When he looked up, Rayner felt a jolt of recognition that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than memory. His eyes were the color of winter sky, pale blue-gray and sharp with intelligence, set in a face that had been carved lean by weather and experience. A scar ran from his left temple to his jaw, thin as a pencil line but deep enough to have left its permanent mark. "Ma'am," he said, touching the brim of his hat with 2 fingers in a gesture that belonged to an earlier generation. His voice carried the slight roughness of someone who spent more time talking to horses than people. "Morning," Rayner replied, studying his face and trying to place where she'd seen those eyes before. "You're out early for someone just passing through." "Not passing through," he said simply, "looking for work." The words carried no particular emphasis, but something in his tone suggested this wasn't a casual inquiry. He glanced towards Stormfire, who had approached the fence and stood watching the stranger with unusual calm. The Stallion's typical restlessness had stilled, as if the presence of this particular man had somehow quieted the storm that always seemed to rage just beneath his sleek black surface. "What kind of work?" Rayner asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Horses, mostly. Breaking, training, whatever needs doing." He pulled a small leather journal from his coat pocket, the cover worn smooth by countless handlings. The pages inside were filled with sketches of horses in various poses, running, grazing, rearing drawn, with the careful attention to detail that came from genuine understanding rather than artistic pretension. Notes were scattered throughout in a precise handwriting that looked like it belonged to someone accustomed to keeping records under difficult conditions. "That's Stormfire," Rayner said, nodding toward the stallion. "Beautiful animal, but he's got opinions about men trying to ride him." The stranger studied Stormfire with the kind of focused attention that most people reserved for complex machinery or mathematical equations. He watched the way the horse moved, the set of his ears, the rhythm of his breathing. When Stormfire took a step closer to the fence, the man extended his hand palm up, allowing the stallion to catch his scent. "He's not mean," the stranger observed after several minutes of silent communication. "Just hasn't found anyone who speaks his language." Before Rayner could respond, Stormfire stretched his neck forward and touched his muzzle to the man's outstretched palm. The contact lasted only seconds, but it represented more trust than the stallion had shown any stranger since arriving at Devil's Spur. Rayner felt her breath catch in her throat as she watched the impossible her wild, untouchable horse accepting the presence of a man he'd never seen before. "I don't believe I caught your name," she said, though something deep in her memory was already whispering the answer. "Colt," he replied, his pale eyes meeting hers directly. "Colt Avery." The name hit her like cold water thrown in her face. Colt Avery, the ghost story that old-timers told around campfires, the legend that parents used to keep children from wandering too far from home after dark. 5 years ago, he'd been the most successful bounty hunter in 3 territories, tracking down outlaws and desperados that other men couldn't find. Then he'd taken on the Hawkins gang, a job that went sideways in ways that left good men dead, and Colt Avery disappeared like smoke in wind. "Thought you were dead," Rayner said quietly. "Seemed like the safest thing to let people think." Miguel Santos chose that moment to emerge from the barn, probably drawn by the sound of voices and the stranger's horse. The foreman's weathered face went through a series of expressions: curiosity, recognition, and finally the wary respect of someone who had heard enough stories to know when he was in the presence of genuine danger. "Mr. Avery," Miguel said, his voice carefully neutral. "Been a long time." "Miguel." Colt's acknowledgement carried the weight of shared history. "You're looking well." "Better than expected, considering." Miguel's dark eyes flicked between Colt and Rayner, clearly uncomfortable with the situation, but unwilling to be openly rude to a man who had once done him a significant favor. "Miss Rayner, this is the man I told you about. The one who helped my nephew when those rustlers—" "I remember the story," Rayner interrupted, pieces of a puzzle clicking into place. Miguel's nephew had been caught rustling cattle 5 years ago, framed by a gang that used young men as scapegoats while they moved stolen livestock across territorial lines. Someone had provided evidence that cleared the boy's name and put the real criminals behind bars. Miguel had never named his benefactor, but he'd spoken with deep gratitude about the man who had saved his family from disgrace. Word of Colt's presence spread through the ranch with the speed that news always traveled in small communities. By mid-morning, a crowd had gathered at the corral fencer ranch hands from Devil's Spur and neighboring spreads, townspeople who had driven out to see for themselves if the rumors were true, and a few old-timers who claimed to remember when Colt Avery was just another cowboy trying to make an honest living. Tommy Rodriguez, the young cowboy who had been unseated by Stormfire just 2 weeks earlier, pushed through the crowd with the swagger of someone trying to reclaim lost pride. "You're the famous bounty hunter," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Heard you could track a shadow across solid rock." "Used to could," Colt replied mildly, not taking his eyes off Stormfire. "But can you ride that devil horse?" Tommy pressed, gesturing toward the Stallion, who stood calmly beside the fence, seemingly indifferent to the crowd's attention. "Because if you can't, then maybe all those stories are just that, stories." A murmur went through the gathered spectators, the kind of anticipatory sound that preceded either spectacular success or catastrophic failure. Raina found herself caught between wanting to protect Stormfire from another rough handling and curiosity about what this legendary man might accomplish. "Tommy," Miguel warned, but the young cowboy was already opening the corral gate. Colt entered the corral with the same unhurried movements he'd used to dismount his horse, carrying nothing but a simple rope halter and the kind of calm confidence that comes from understanding your own capabilities. Stormfire turned to face him, not with the aggressive posturing that usually accompanied such encounters, but with alert curiosity. What followed defied everything Raina thought she knew about her horse. Colt approached Stormfire with a directness that should have triggered the Stallion's defensive instincts, but instead of rearing or striking, Stormfire stood perfectly still. Colt spoke to him in a voice too low for the crowd to hear, words that seemed to flow between them like shared secrets. The halter slipped over Stormfire's head without struggle. The Stallion accepted it as naturally as if he'd been wearing halters all his life, his dark eyes focused entirely on Colt's face, as if trying to read some message written there in a language older than words. When Colt swung onto Stormfire's back, there was no explosion of fury, no wild bucking or desperate attempts to dislodge his rider. The Stallion stood quietly for a moment, as if processing this new experience, then began to move with a fluid grace that made rider and horse appear to be communicating through some form of telepathy. They moved around the corral in perfect harmony, Stormfire responding to shifts in Colt's weight and balance rather than to commands shouted over the sound of hoofbeats. The crowd fell silent, witnessing something that felt more like magic than horsemanship, a demonstration of partnership between man and animal that transcended the usual battle of wills. After several minutes, Colt guided Stormfire to where Raina stood at the fence. The Stallion halted with the precision of a well-trained cavalry mount, and Colt dismounted with the same fluid grace he'd used to mount. He removed the halter and handed it to Raina, their fingers brushing briefly in the exchange. "He's not broken," Colt said quietly, his pale eyes serious. "He's just been waiting for someone who understood the difference between partnership and domination." The crowd began to disperse, people talking in hushed voices about what they'd witnessed, but Raina barely noticed their departure. She was studying Colt Avery's face, trying to reconcile the gentleman who had just performed a miracle with her horse against the dangerous legend who had tracked killers across impossible terrain. "Why here?" she asked, when they were alone except for Miguel, who lingered nearby with the protective instincts of someone who considered himself responsible for her safety. "Why now?" Colt's expression became guarded, the openness that had characterized his interaction with Stormfire replaced by the careful neutrality of someone accustomed to keeping secrets. Sometimes a man needs to stop running and remember who he used to be. But there was something else in his eyes, a shadow of knowledge that suggested his arrival at Devil's Spur Ranch wasn't as random as he wanted her to believe. Raina felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning breeze, a sense that forces beyond her understanding were already in motion around her. "I can offer you work," she said finally, "if you're really looking for it." "I appreciate that, Miss Carraway, more than you know." As he led his dusty gelding toward the barn, Raina watched the way he moved, the careful alertness that never completely relaxed, the habit of checking sightlines and escape routes that marked him as a man who had spent years expecting trouble to find him. Whatever had brought Colt Avery to Devil's Spur Ranch, she suspected it had very little to do with honest work and everything to do with the kind of past that followed a man like a shadow, patient and persistent and impossible to outrun forever. 3 days after Colt Avery's arrival, Raina discovered that having a legend working on your ranch created complications she hadn't anticipated. Word had spread throughout the county with the speed of prairie fire, bringing visitors to Devil's Spur who had never shown interest in ranch operations before. Some came out of curiosity, others with the kind of morbid fascination that drew people to sites of famous disasters, and a few arrived with the calculating expressions of men who saw opportunity in another man's reputation. Colt worked through the attention with the same quiet efficiency he brought to everything else, focusing on the horses with a concentration that seemed to shut out the rest of the world. In just 3 days, he had accomplished more with the ranch's horse stock than most trainers managed in months. The 2-year-old colts that had been showing signs of stubbornness now followed him around like devoted dogs, and the older geldings that Raina used for cattle work had developed a responsiveness that made her daily tasks noticeably easier. She found herself watching him work from the kitchen window while she prepared meals, fascinated by the way he communicated with animals through body language and intuition rather than force and dominance. He never raised his voice, never showed frustration when a horse failed to understand what he wanted, and never resorted to the harsh methods that some trainers considered necessary for difficult animals. "He's got a gift," Miguel observed, joining her at the window as Colt worked with a young mare that had been injured in a fall and refused to trust humans near her hindquarters. "My grandfather used to tell stories about men like Thathorse whisperers," he called them. Said they could hear what the animals were thinking. Raina watched Colt approach the nervous mare with infinite patience, allowing her to set the pace of their interaction. "What else did your grandfather say about men like that?" "That they usually carried heavy burdens." Said a man who understood animals that well had probably forgotten how to trust people. The observation hit closer to the truth than Raina cared to examine. In the evenings, when the work was done and the other hands gathered around the bunkhouse table for cards and conversation, Colt would disappear into the gathering darkness like smoke. She'd glimpsed him once, sitting alone on the corral fence with Stormfire grazing nearby, both man and horse silhouetted against the star-filled sky-like figures from an old painting. On the 4th morning, Marcus Wheeler arrived, unannounced, driving his polished truck with the careful precision that characterized everything he did. He found Raina in the barn, checking a mare that was due to foal within the week, and his expression suggested he wasn't happy about the recent developments at Devil's Spur Ranch. "We need to talk," he said without preamble, his pale blue eyes serious behind wire-rimmed glasses that always made him look more like a banker than a rancher. "Good morning to you too, Marcus." Raina continued her examination of the mare, running her hands along the swollen sides and checking for signs of distress. "You know why I'm here. I know you've been listening to gossip in town." Marcus stepped closer, lowering his voice even though they were alone in the barn. "Raina, this isn't gossip. Colt Avery is a dangerous man with a dangerous past. The kind of past that follows people and brings trouble to everyone around them." She straightened, meeting his concerned gaze directly. "He's been nothing but helpful since he arrived. The horses respond to him better than anyone I've ever seen." "That's not the point." Marcus ran a hand through his perfectly combed hair, a gesture that revealed the depth of his agitation. The point is that there are people who might come looking for him, and when they do, you'll be caught in the middle of something that has nothing to do with you." From his coat pocket, Marcus withdrew a yellowed wanted poster, the paper creased from folding and refolding. The image was faded but clear enough to show a younger Colt Avery, his face harder and his eyes holding none of the gentle patience she'd observed during his work with the horses. Below the picture, bold letters proclaimed a reward for information leading to the capture of members of the Hawkins gang, wanted for bank robbery, cattle rustling, and murder. "This is 5 years old," Rayner said, studying the poster, "and it's for the gang he was hunting, not Colt himself. Read the fine print at the bottom." In smaller text, almost too faded to make out, were the words, "Bounty hunter Colt Avery, wanted for questioning in connection with the deaths of 3 gang members. Approach with extreme caution." Questioning isn't the same as charges, Rayner pointed out, but she felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cool morning air in the barn. "Rayner, listen to me." Marcus took her hands in his grip warm and steady. "I care about you, we all do. This ranch, this community, we look out for each other. Bringing a man like that into our midst puts everyone at risk." Before she could respond, Colt appeared in the barn doorway, moving with the silent grace that seemed to be his natural state. He took in the scene, Marcus holding her hands, the wanted poster lying on the hay bale between them, and his expression shifted into the careful neutrality that meant he was processing potential threats. "Mr. Wheeler," he said politely, touching the brim of his hat. "Didn't expect to see you here this early." Marcus released Rayner's hands and turned to face Colt, his shoulders squaring in the unconscious way men prepared for confrontation. "Mr. Avery, I was just discussing some concerns with Miss Carraway." "I imagine you were." Colt's pale eyes moved to the wanted poster, and something that might have been resignation flickered across his features. "That's quite a conversation piece you've brought. The truth has a way of surfacing eventually." "Yes, it does." Colt stepped fully into the barn, his movements careful and controlled. "The truth is that I spent 2 years tracking the Hawkins gang across 4 territories. The truth is that when I finally caught up with them, 3 of their members chose to go down fighting rather than surrender. The truth is that I was cleared of any wrongdoing by a territorial judge. But some people prefer the more colorful version of events." Marcus's jaw tightened. "And the truth about why you're here, why you chose this particular ranch to grace with your presence." The question hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire, and Rayner found herself holding her breath as she waited for Colt's answer. She realized in that moment that she wanted to believe there was something special about Devil's Spur Ranch that had drawn him here, something personal and meaningful rather than mere convenience. "Sometimes a man gets tired of running," Colt said finally. "Sometimes he wants to remember what it feels like to do honest work without looking over his shoulder." "And sometimes," Marcus replied, "a man brings his troubles with him whether he means to or not." The tension in the barn had become thick enough to cut with a knife. 2 men sizing each other up across invisible battle lines that had nothing to do with wanted posters and everything to do with a woman who stood between them. Rayner felt the familiar frustration that came with being discussed rather than consulted, as if her own judgment and wishes were somehow irrelevant to the men who claimed to care about her welfare. "I think," she said, her voice carrying the kind of authority that came from 3 generations of Carraway women who had run this ranch, "that I'm capable of making my own decisions about who works here and who doesn't." Both men turned to look at her, and she saw surprise in Marcus's eyes and something that might have been gratitude in Colt's. But before either could respond, Miguel appeared in the barn entrance, his weathered face creased with concern. "Miss Rayner, we've got riders coming up the main road, 3 of them, moving fast." The news sent a different kind of tension rippling through the barn, the kind that came with genuine rather than personal threat. Colt's entire demeanor shifted, the careful relaxation that had characterized his work on the ranch, replaced by the alert readiness of someone accustomed to danger. "How far out?" he asked Miguel. "Maybe 10 minutes at their current pace." "You recognize them?" Miguel shook his head. Never seen them before, but they've got the look of men who aren't here for social calls. Marcus stepped protectively closer to Rayna. We should call the sheriff. Not enough time, Colt said, already moving toward the barn's rear exit. And probably not necessary, but it might be best if you folks stayed inside until we know what they want. Where are you going? Rayna called after him. To have a conversation. Colt paused at the doorway, his pale eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her stomach tighten. And to find out if the past is as dead as I hoped it was. He disappeared into the morning shadows, leaving Rayna standing between Marcus and Miguel, both men radiating the kind of protective energy that usually made her feel claustrophobic. But today, with unknown riders approaching and Colt Avery preparing to face whatever ghosts had finally caught up with him, she found herself grateful for their presence, even as she worried about the man who had walked into danger with nothing but quiet courage and whatever secrets he carried in that worn leather journal. The three riders turned out to be cattle buyers from Denver, dusty and road-weary from a long journey to inspect stock at neighboring ranches. Their leader, a portly man with intelligent eyes and a gold tooth that gleamed when he smiled, apologized profusely for arriving unannounced and explained that they'd gotten lost trying to find the Circle W ranch. Rayna watched from the kitchen window as Colt emerged from whatever hiding place he'd chosen, his shoulders relaxing as he assessed the genuine nature of their visit. Marcus directed the men toward his property with the kind of gracious efficiency that had made the Wheeler family successful in business for 3 generations, but not before shooting a meaningful look at Rayna that clearly said this incident proved his point about the dangers of harboring men with complicated pasts. After the visitors departed, an uncomfortable silence settled over Devil's Spur Ranch like dust after a windstorm. The hands went about their daily tasks with the kind of focused attention that meant they were all thinking about things they couldn't discuss openly, and even Stormfire seemed to sense the tension, pacing his corral with restless energy that made his black coat shimmer like oil in the afternoon sun. Colt threw himself into his work with renewed intensity, as if physical labor could somehow atone for the disruption his presence had caused. Rayna found herself torn between admiration for his dedication and frustration, with his apparent determination to pretend the morning's events hadn't revealed the precarious nature of his position at the ranch. That evening, she carried 2 cups of coffee to the corral, where she'd seen him settle for his usual solitary vigil with Stormfire. The stallion lifted his head as she approached, nickering softly in greeting, but Colt remained motionless on the fence rail, his attention fixed on some point beyond the horizon where the last light of day painted the sky in shades of copper and gold. "Thought you might be thirsty," she said, offering him one of the cups. "Thank you." He accepted the coffee without taking his eyes off the distant mountains, and she noticed that his hands, always steady when working with horses, showed a slight tremor that spoke of tension held carefully in check. "Those men this morning weren't the ones I was expecting," he finished for her. "But they will come, Miss Carraway. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but they will come." Rayna climbed onto the fence rail beside him, close enough to catch the faint scent of leather and sage that seemed to cling to his clothes. "The Hawkins gang?" "What's left of them?" Colt sipped his coffee, the steam rising around his face like fog around a mountain peak. "Jake Hawkins died in that last confrontation 5 years ago. So did his brother Tom and their cousin Billy. But Jake had a son, Ezra, and that boy has been carrying a grudge ever since. If the law cleared you, the law and justice aren't always the same thing, and boys who lose their fathers don't much care about legal technicalities." The quiet pain in his voice made her want to reach out and touch his hand, to offer some comfort for burdens that seemed too heavy for one man to carry alone. Instead, she sat in silence, watching Stormfire crop grass in the gathering darkness, while stars began to appear in the clear evening sky. "Why horses?" she asked finally. "With your skills, you could have been anything, lawman, military scout, ranch foreman. Why choose to work with animals instead of people?" Colt was quiet for so long that she wondered if he intended to answer at all. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of hard-won wisdom. "Horses are honest. They don't lie about their intentions or pretend to be something they're not. When a horse trusts you, it's because you've earned it through consistency and patience, not because you've convinced them to ignore their instincts. And people are more complicated. They can smile while planning to stick a knife in your back, or claim to care about your welfare while using you for their own purposes. The bitterness in his tone made her wonder how many times he'd been betrayed by people he'd trusted, how many friends had turned into enemies when circumstances changed. She thought about Marcus's visit that morning, his genuine concern mixed with territorial protectiveness, and realized that even well-meaning people could become obstacles when their fears overrode their compassion. "Marcus Wheeler is a good man," she said carefully. "He's worried about me getting caught up in something dangerous. He's right to be worried. But he's wrong about you." Colt turned to look at her then, his pale eyes searching her face as if trying to understand what she saw when she looked at him. "How can you be so sure? You've known me less than a week." Sometimes you know things about people without being able to explain how. From the pocket of her jacket, she withdrew a small velvet box that she'd carried down from her bedroom, a keepsake she hadn't opened in years. "This was my grandmother's wedding ring. She gave it to my mother, who was supposed to give it to me when I found someone worth marrying." The ring was simply thin gold band, worn smooth by decades of wear, with a single small diamond that caught starlight like captured hope. Raina held it in her palm, feeling the weight of generations of caraway women who had trusted their hearts to men they believed would honor that trust. "My mother died when I was 16, she continued. "She never got the chance to pass this on properly, so I've carried it with me, waiting for the right moment to understand why she thought it was important. And now you do. Now I think I understand that love isn't about finding someone safe. It's about finding someone worth taking risks for." Colt stared at the ring for a long moment, then shook his head with the kind of gentle firmness that suggested he'd already made up his mind about something. "Miss Caraway Raina, you don't know what you're saying. The things I've done, the people who might come looking for me. I know what I see when I watch you with the horses. I know what I feel when you look at me like you're seeing something precious instead of something to be protected or possessed." The admission hung between them like a bridge that could either connect them or collapse under the weight of honesty. Raina felt her heart hammering against her ribs as she waited for his response, knowing that whatever he said next would determine whether this fragile connection they'd been building would survive or shatter like glass against stone. "I'm not the man you think I am," he said quietly. "You're exactly the man I think you are. You're just afraid to believe it yourself." Before he could respond, the sound of hoofbeats approaching at a gallop shattered the intimate quiet of their conversation. Both of them tensed, old reflexes taking over as they scanned the darkness for the source of the disturbance. A single rider appeared in the pool of light cast by the ranch house porch, and Raina recognized Tommy Rodriguez despite the dust that covered his clothes and the wild-eyed look of someone who had ridden hard with urgent news. "Miss Raina," he called out, sliding from his horse with a kind of graceless haste that meant trouble. "You need to know there's men in town asking questions about Mr. Avery. 3 of them just rode in on horses that looked like they'd been pushed hard for days." Colt was already moving, dropping from the fence rail with fluid grace and heading toward the barn where he kept his gear. "What kind of questions?" he called over his shoulder. "The kind that made Sheriff Davidson nervous enough to send me out here with a warning." Tommy's young face was serious in the lamplight. "He said to tell you that if you had somewhere else to be for the next few days, it might be wise to consider a change of scenery, and leave Miss Caraway to deal with whatever comes." The quiet steel in Colt's voice made Tommy step back a pace, and Raina felt a thrill of something that might have been fear or excitement or both. This was the man whose reputation had kept outlaws awake at night, the hunter who had tracked the Hawkins gang across impossible terrain and brought them to justice when no one else could. "I'm not going anywhere," she said firmly, standing and brushing dust from her jeans. "This is my ranch, and I don't run from trouble." "Raina." "No." She moved to stand beside him, close enough to feel the tension radiating from his body like heat from a forge. You said horses are honest. Well, people can be honest too. And I'm being honest when I say that whatever's coming, we face it together. Colt studied her face in the lamplight, looking for some sign that she didn't understand the magnitude of what she was offering. When he found only determination and something deeper that made her pulse quicken, he nodded slowly. Together then, he agreed, but we do this smart, and we do it on our terms. As they walked toward the house to make plans for whatever morning might bring, Raina slipped her grandmother's ring back into its velvet box, but she didn't return it to her pocket. Some things she was beginning to understand were worth the risk of losing if it meant the chance to truly live. The next morning brought Harold Ashworth from the bank, arriving in his pristine black automobile with the punctuality that characterized all his business dealings. He found Raina in the ranch office, surrounded by ledgers and bills that seemed to multiply like rabbits, no matter how many hours she spent trying to organize them into manageable piles. "Miss Carraway," he said, settling his considerable bulk into the chair across from her father's old desk. His silver pocket watch caught the morning light streaming through windows that badly needed cleaning. "I'm afraid I have some rather pressing concerns to discuss with you." Raina set down her pen and gave him her full attention, though her heart was already sinking with the weight of whatever news had brought him out to Devil's Spur so early in the day. "What kind of concerns, Mr. Ashworth?" "The kind that require difficult decisions." He withdrew a manila folder from his leather satchel, the papers inside rustling with the sound of financial obligations that had grown beyond her ability to meet them. "Your mortgage payment was late last month, and this month's installment is already overdue by 2 weeks. The numbers on the papers might as well have been written in a foreign language for all the hope they offered. Feed costs, veterinary bills, equipment repairs, salaries for the ranch, hands all of it, adding up to a sum that exceeded her income by a margin that grew wider each month. The cattle market had been depressed for 2 years running, and the horse breeding program that had been her father's pride was still years away from generating the kind of revenue that could save the ranch. "I can give you another month," Ashworth continued, his voice carrying the careful neutrality of a man who had delivered similar news to other families facing similar circumstances. "But beyond that, I'm afraid the bank's board of directors won't allow me any more flexibility." Through the window, Raina could see Colt working with a young gelding in the training corral, his movements patient and purposeful as he taught the horse to respond to subtle pressure and release. The sight of his steady competence provided a strange comfort, even as her world seemed to be crumbling around the edges like old paper. "What are my options?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "You could sell portions of the property. The back section along Devil's Canyon would bring good money from those developers who've been making inquiries. Keep the house, and maybe 100 acres around it enough for a small operation, but not the burden of trying to maintain 15,000 acres on your own." The suggestion hit her like a physical blow. Devil's Canyon wasn't just land to Herrit, was the place where her father had taught her to read cattle tracks and weather signs, where her grandmother had taken her to collect wildflowers for the kitchen table, where 3 generations of Carraways had found solace and strength in the wide-open spaces that seemed to stretch all the way to heaven. "Or," Ashworth continued, clearly uncomfortable with the pain he saw in her expression, "there's Marcus Wheeler's offer. He's made it clear that he'd be willing to assume the ranch's debts in exchange for a partnership arrangement. Marriage would consolidate the properties and create one of the largest operations in the territory." The words hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire, and Raina felt something cold settle in the pit of her stomach. Marcus had never spoken directly about marriage, but his intentions had been clear enough in the way he looked at her, the way he positioned himself as her protector and advisor, the way he spoke about their properties as if they were naturally meant to be joined. "I'm not ready to make that kind of decision," she said finally. "I understand. But time isn't a luxury you have much of." Ashworth returned the papers to his folder with the brisk efficiency of a man who had delivered unwelcome news to dozens of families facing similar circumstances. These developers from back east aren't patient people, and Marcus Wheeler won't wait forever for an answer. After he left, Raina sat alone in the office that still smelled of her father's pipe, tobacco, and old leather, surrounded by the weight of responsibility that felt heavier with each passing day. The silver spurs hanging beside the door caught a shaft of sunlight, their tarnished surface reflecting fragmented images of a past that seemed simpler and more certain than the present. A soft knock at the door interrupted her brooding, and Colt appeared in the doorway with the careful hesitation of someone who understood he might be intruding on private grief. His pale eyes took in her expression and the scattered papers on the desk, and she saw comprehension flicker across his weathered features. "Bad news?" he asked gently. "The kind that makes a person question everything they thought they knew about their life." She gestured to the chair Ashworth had vacated. "The bank wants their money, and I don't have it." Colt settled into the chair with the fluid grace that characterized all his movements, his presence somehow making the cramped office feel less oppressive. "How bad?" "Bad enough that selling parts of the ranch looks like the only option. Or," she trailed off, unable to voice the alternative that Marcus represented. "Or, Marcus Wheeler has made it clear that marriage would solve my financial problems." Something shifted in Colt's expression, a tightening around his eyes that might have been pain or anger or both. "And what do you want?" The simple question caught her off guard with its directness. Most people, Marcus, the bank president, even well-meaning neighbors stalked around her, wishes as if her desires were less important than practical considerations and social expectations. "I want to keep this place," she said honestly. "I want to honor what my family built here, and I want—" She stopped, the words catching in her throat. "What do you want, Raina?" The gentleness in his voice, the way he spoke her name like something precious, made her look up and meet his eyes directly. In them she saw understanding and patience, and something deeper that made her heart race with possibilities she'd never allowed herself to consider seriously. "I want to choose my own path," she whispered, "not have it chosen for me by circumstances or other people's expectations." Before Colt could respond, the sound of approaching horses interrupted the moment. Through the window, they could see Marcus Wheeler riding up the main road with two other men, their purposeful pace suggesting this wasn't a social call. Even from a distance, something about the strangers struck Raina as wrong, too alert, too watchful, their eyes constantly scanning their surroundings in the manner of men accustomed to danger. Colt was already moving, his entire demeanor shifting from gentle confidant to the predatory alertness that had made him legendary as a tracker of dangerous men. "Stay inside," he said, his voice carrying an authority that brooked no argument, "and keep away from the windows." Colt wait, but he was already gone, slipping out the back door of the office with the silent grace of a shadow. Through the window, she watched him disappear around the corner of the barn, positioning himself where he could observe the approaching riders without being seen. Marcus and his companions reached the declaration stone and dismounted with the casual confidence of men who had every right to be there. But as they drew closer to the house, Raina could see the tension in Marcus's posture, the way his hand rested near the pistol at his hip in an unconscious gesture of readiness. "Raina," he called out, his voice carrying the forced cheerfulness of someone trying to appear normal under abnormal circumstances. "Could you come out here for a moment? There are some people I'd like you to meet." She remained in the office, remembering Colt's warning and trusting the instincts that told her these strangers represented danger in ways she didn't yet understand. Through the window, she could see Marcus growing increasingly agitated as the seconds passed without a response. One of the strangers, a tall man with prematurely grey hair and the kind of pale eyes that seemed to take in everything without revealing anything, stepped closer to the house. "Maybe she can't hear you," he suggested, his voice carrying easily in the morning air. "She's here," Marcus replied, his discomfort becoming more obvious. "Her horse is in the corral, and there's fresh coffee on the stove. Raina, please, we just want to talk." The plea in his voice made her heart ache with sympathy for a man who had somehow gotten caught between his feelings for her and forces he didn't understand. But she remained where she was, watching and waiting for some sign from Colt that would tell her what to do next. The grey-haired stranger's patience seemed to evaporate like morning dew. "Mr. Wheeler, I think we need to be more direct about our intentions. Time is a luxury we don't have." "Now, hold on," Marcus began, but the man was already moving toward the house with the purposeful stride of someone accustomed to getting what he wanted through intimidation or force. That's when Colt appeared. He stepped into view from behind the barn with the sudden materialization of a ghost made flesh, his hands empty, but positioned in a way that suggested he could remedy that situation with lightning speed if necessary. The grey-haired man froze mid-stride, his pale eyes widening with recognition and something that might have been fear. "Ezra Hawkins," Colt said, his voice carrying across the yard with the quiet authority of a judge pronouncing sentence. "Been a long time." The name hit Raina like a physical blow. Ezra Hawkins, the son Colt had mentioned, the boy carrying a grudge that had festered for 5 years until it had grown into this moment of confrontation in her front yard. "Not near long enough," Hawkins replied, his hand moving toward his gun with the deliberate slowness of someone testing boundaries. "But long enough for me to learn some interesting things about you, Mr. Avery. Things that might surprise the nice people who've been so kind as to give you shelter." The threat hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire, and Raina felt the delicate balance of her world tilting toward something irrevocable and dangerous. Whatever secrets Colt carried, whatever truths Ezra Hawkins had come to reveal, she knew that the next few minutes would determine not just her own future, but the fate of everyone she cared about. The standoff in her front yard stretched like a taut wire ready to snap, with Marcus caught between forces he clearly didn't understand, and Raina trapped inside the house, watching through windows that suddenly felt more like bars than glass. The two men with Ezra Hawkins had spread out in the classic formation of gunfighters preparing for trouble, their hands hovering near their weapons with the practiced ease of men who had done this dance before. "You always did have a talent for showing up where you weren't wanted," Colt observed, his voice carrying the deceptive calm of deep water running over sharp rocks. "But involving innocent people in your family grudge is a new low, even for a Hawkins." "Innocent?" Ezra's laugh held no humor, only the bitter edge of old pain sharpened by years of nursing grievances. "Tell Miss Carraway about Mineral Creek, Avery. Tell her about the 3 men you gunned down in cold blood while they were trying to surrender." The accusation hit the morning air like thunder after lightning, and Raina felt her breath catch in her throat. Through the window, she could see the tension in Colt's shoulders, the way his jaw tightened, as if the words had struck him physically. "They weren't surrendering," Colt replied, each word precise and carefully chosen. "They were reloading behind cover, and you know it. That's not how the witnesses remembered it. Paid witnesses. Your father always did have more money than honor." Marcus stepped forward, his face pale with the realization that he'd been manipulated into bringing dangerous men to the woman he claimed to care about. "Hawkins, I think there's been a misunderstanding. When you approached me in town, you said you were federal marshals investigating." "We are investigating," Ezra interrupted, pulling a badge from his vest pocket and holding it up for inspection. "Investigating crimes that were covered up by territorial politics and federal corruption. Investigating a man who murdered my father and 2 of my cousins in cold blood." The badge looked official enough to fool someone who wanted to believe in the authority it represented, but Raina noticed how Ezra held it at an angle that made it difficult to read clearly. Real lawmen, in her experience, didn't need to wave their credentials around like theatrical props. "If you're really federal marshals," Colt said, echoing her thoughts, "then you'll have proper warrants and extradition papers. Let's see them." The request seemed to catch Hawkins off guard, his pale eyes flickering toward his companions with the uncertainty of someone whose bluff had been called. "We don't need warrants to question a suspect. You do to arrest one, and you sure as hell need them to threaten innocent civilians." The verbal sparring might have continued indefinitely if not for the sound of additional riders approaching from the direction of town. Sheriff Davidson appeared at the head of a small posse that included Tommy Rodriguez and two other local men, all of them armed and looking like they meant business. "Morning, folks," Davidson called out as he dismounted near the declaration stone. "Heard there might be some sort of federal investigation going on out here. Thought I'd better come see if you gentlemen needed any assistance." The sheriff was a lean man in his 50s with grey hair and intelligent eyes that missed very little. He'd held the job for 15 years through the kind of steady competence that came from understanding people and situations rather than relying on intimidation or force. "Sheriff Davidson," Marcus said, relief evident in his voice. "These men claim to be federal marshals investigating Mr. Avery, but they don't have any paperwork to support their claims." Davidson finished, his gaze fixed on Ezra Hawkins with the patient attention of a cat watching a mouse hole. "Funny thing about that, I sent a telegram to Denver yesterday asking about any federal operations in my jurisdiction, and they don't seem to know anything about you, gentlemen." Hawkins's face had gone pale beneath his tan, but his voice remained steady. "There are operations that local law enforcement isn't privy to, Sheriff. I'm sure you understand the need for discretion in certain cases." "Oh, I understand discretion just fine. What I don't understand is why federal marshals would need to involve civilians in their investigation." Davidson's hand rested casually on his gun butt, and his deputies had positioned themselves to cover different angles of approach, especially civilians who might get hurt if things went sideways. The tactical situation had shifted dramatically in the space of a few sentences, and Ezra Hawkins was clearly reassessing his options. The element of surprise was gone. He was outnumbered by legitimate lawmen, and his carefully constructed deception was unraveling like cheap cloth in rain. "This isn't over, Avery," he said, his voice carrying the promise of future violence. "Justice delayed isn't justice denied." "Justice?" Colt stepped forward, his pale eyes blazing with controlled anger. "Your father robbed banks and killed innocent people. Your cousins were part of a gang that terrorized honest folks from here to Colorado. If you want to talk about justice, let's talk about the families they destroyed and the lives they cut short. They were my family." The anguished cry revealed the pain beneath Ezra's carefully maintained facade, the grief of a young man who had lost his father and chosen to honor that loss with vengeance rather than acceptance. For a moment, Raina felt a flicker of sympathy for him, remembering her own struggle to come to terms with her father's death and the weight of carrying on his legacy. "I understand loss," Colt said, his voice gentling slightly. "I understand wanting someone to blame when the world takes away the people you love, but turning that pain into a weapon only creates more suffering. Easy words from the man who pulled the trigger, hard words from the man who had to live with the consequences." The quiet pain in Colt's admission seemed to deflate some of Ezra's anger, replacing it with confusion and the dawning realization that vengeance might not provide the satisfaction he'd been seeking. But before he could respond, one of his companions, a wiry man with nervous eyes and twitching hands, made the decision for all of them. "Enough talking," he snarled, reaching for his gun with the desperate speed of someone who knew the odds were against him. The next few seconds unfolded with the terrible clarity that comes during moments of crisis, when time seems to slow and every detail becomes etched in memory with painful precision. Sheriff Davidson shouted a warning, his own weapon clearing leather with practiced ease. Marcus dove for cover behind the declaration stone, proving that whatever else he might be, he possessed good survival instincts. But it was Colt who moved with the fluid speed that separated legends from ordinary men, his hand finding his gun and bringing it to bear with motions so economical they seemed almost casual. The sound of gunfire shattered the morning quiet, sending birds exploding from nearby trees and causing Stormfire to rear in his corral with wild-eyed alarm. When the echoes faded and the gun smoke cleared, the nervous man lay on the ground clutching a shattered wrist while his weapon lay several feet away in the dust. Ezra Hawkins stood frozen with his own gun half-drawn, staring at Colt with the wide-eyed expression of someone who had just witnessed something that challenged everything he thought he knew about speed and skill. "Next man who draws iron is going to need a doctor instead of a bandage," Colt announced, his voice carrying the absolute authority of someone who had just demonstrated his capabilities beyond any reasonable doubt. Sheriff Davidson moved quickly to secure the situation, disarming Ezra and his remaining companion, while Tommy Rodriguez helped the wounded man to his feet. The false federal marshals looked considerably less impressive now, reduced from threatening predators to ordinary criminals caught in a scheme that had gone badly wrong. "I'll be taking these gentlemen to town for a little conversation about impersonating federal officers," Davidson announced. "Seems like there might be warrants out on them for other activities as well." As the sheriff and his posse loaded their prisoners onto horses for the ride back to town, Rayna finally emerged from the house on unsteady legs. The confrontation had lasted only minutes, but it felt like hours had passed since she'd watched Ezra Hawkins step into her yard with his talk of justice and federal investigations. Marcus approached her with obvious relief, but there was something different in his expression now, a new wariness that suggested the morning's events had changed more than just the immediate situation. "Are you all right?" he asked, though his eyes kept drifting to Colt, who was checking his weapon before returning it to its holster. "I'm fine," she assured him, though her voice shook slightly. "Thanks to the sheriff's timing. And Mr. Avery's skill with a gun," Marcus added quietly. "I've heard stories about fast draws, but I've never seen anything like that." There was no admiration in his tone, only the sober recognition of someone who had witnessed capabilities that belonged more to legend than reality. Marcus Wheeler was a good man who solved problems through negotiation and compromise, and the casual violence that Colt had just displayed was as foreign to his nature as speaking in tongues. "This changes things," he said, his pale eyes serious as they met hers. "What happened here today, it proves that danger follows him wherever he goes. Is that really the kind of life you want, Rayna?" The question hung between them like a bridge she would have to cross or burn, and she realized that Marcus was asking her to choose not just between two men, but between two completely different ways of living. Safety and predictability on one side, uncertainty and risk on the other. As she watched Colt speaking quietly with Sheriff Davidson, pointing out details about the confrontation that only someone with his experience would notice, she thought about the hidden safe in her father's office that she'd discovered just the night before. The safe she hadn't known existed until a loose floorboard had revealed its hiding place, along with documents that cast her father's death in a very different light than she'd always believed. That evening, after Marcus had departed with reluctant backward glances and promises to check on her safety, Rayna led Colt to her father's office and the discovery that had kept her awake most of the previous night. The hidden safe behind the loose floorboard contained more than family documents and property deeds. It held secrets that recontextualized everything she thought she knew about her father's death and Colt's presence at Devil's Spur Ranch. "I found this yesterday while looking for the original ranch survey," she said, kneeling beside the heavy iron box that had been concealed beneath hand-hewn floorboards for God knew how many years. The lock was already broken, probably had been for years. Inside the safe, wrapped in oiled cloth that had protected them from moisture and time, were documents that told a story her father had never shared with anyone. Letters written in his careful handwriting, reports that bore official federal seals, and most shocking of all, a deputy U.S. Marshal's badge with Thomas Carraway's name engraved on the back. Colt studied the badge in the lamplight, turning it over in his hands as if it might reveal additional secrets through touch alone. "Your father was a federal marshal?" "Apparently. Look at the dates on these letters." Rayna spread several documents across the desk, pointing to correspondence that painted a picture of a man living a double life for reasons that were only now becoming clear. He wasn't just running a ranch, was providing cover for federal operations, helping track criminals who used this area as a corridor between Mexico and the Northern Territories. The letters revealed a complex web of law enforcement activities that had used Devil's Spur Ranch as a safe house and observation point for over a decade. Thomas Carraway had allowed his neighbors and community to believe he was simply a rancher trying to make an honest living, while secretly providing intelligence about criminal movements to federal authorities. "This letter is addressed to you," Raina said quietly, handing him an envelope that bore his name in her father's distinctive script. "It's dated 3 months before my father died." Colt accepted the letter with obvious reluctance, as if he already knew what it might contain and dreaded having those suspicions confirmed. As he read, his expression grew increasingly grim, and Raina watched the careful composure he'd maintained since arriving at the ranch begin to crack around the edges. "He knew," Colt said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "He knew the Hawkins gang was using Devil's Canyon as a hideout, and he knew I was closing in on them. He was supposed to be my backup when I made the arrest. But he never came, because he was already dead by then. The official report said he fell from his horse and hit his head on a rock, but—" Colt gestured to another document from the safe. This one, a private investigator's report that Thomas had commissioned shortly before his death. He suspected someone was onto his federal connections, someone who wanted to eliminate him before he could provide assistance during the Hawkins arrest. The implications hit Raina like cold water thrown in her face. Her father hadn't died in an accident, he'd been murdered to prevent him from helping capture the very criminals whose surviving family members had just confronted them in her front yard. "There's more," she said, pulling out a leather portfolio that contained surveillance photographs and detailed notes about various criminal activities in the area. "Look at this." The photographs showed meetings between men she didn't recognize and several prominent local citizens, including Harold Ashworth from the bank and, surprisingly, Marcus Wheeler's father, Edmund Wheeler. The notes indicated that some of the region's most respected businessmen had been involved in money laundering operations that helped criminal organizations move their profits through legitimate financial institutions. "Jesus," Colt breathed, studying a photograph that showed Edmund Wheeler shaking hands with a man identified in the notes as a known associate of the Hawkins gang. "Your father was building a case against half the power structure in this county, and someone killed him to stop it." But the most shocking revelation came in the form of a final document, one that Raina had almost overlooked in her initial examination of the safe's contents. It was an official federal appointment, signed by a territorial judge and bearing the seal of the U.S. Marshal's Office, appointing one Colt Avery as a deputy federal marshal with jurisdiction throughout the New Mexico Territory. "You're not a bounty hunter," Raina said, the pieces of a complex puzzle finally clicking into place. "You're a federal marshal. You have been all along." Colt's silence confirmed what she'd already begun to suspect. The legendary bounty hunter was Cover, a carefully constructed identity that allowed him to move through criminal circles without revealing his true purpose. The wanted poster that Marcus had shown her, the accusations about killing gang members in cold blood, all of it, was misdirection designed to protect his real mission. "The Hawkins arrest went wrong because I was expecting backup that never came," he admitted finally. "When your father didn't show up at the designated time, I had to improvise. 3 men died in that canyon because I was trying to take them alive without sufficient support. And Ezra Hawkins has been hunting you ever since, believing you murdered his father in cold blood. While the real killers, the ones who murdered your father to prevent him from participating in the arrest, have been operating freely for 5 years. The weight of revelation settled over the room like dust after an explosion, leaving them both struggling to process the implications of what they'd discovered. Raina thought about the financial pressure she'd been facing, the conveniently timed offers from developers who wanted to buy parts of her ranch, and Harold Ashworth's increasingly urgent demands for mortgage payments. "They want the ranch," she said slowly, understanding dawning like sunrise after a long night. "Not for development, for the same reason my father made it valuable to federal law enforcement. It's the perfect location to control access between Mexico and the northern territories. And with your father gone and the property in financial distress, they can acquire it legally through foreclosure or force you into selling through economic pressure. Unless I marry Marcus Wheeler and consolidate the properties under local control." The comment brought a bitter smile to Colt's lips. Marcus is probably innocent. His father was involved in the money laundering, but the son likely knows nothing about it. He's just a convenient tool to achieve their goals through marriage instead of murder. Then we stop them. Colt's pale eyes searched her face for some sign that she understood the magnitude of what she was suggesting. Raina, these people killed your father. They won't hesitate to kill us too if they think we're getting too close to the truth. Then we better make sure they don't get the chance. She moved to her father's desk and began pulling out maps and documents that would help them understand the full scope of the criminal operation they were facing. If Thomas Carraway had spent years building a case against these people, then somewhere in his files would be the evidence needed to bring them to justice. There's something else, Colt said, producing his own badge from an inner pocket of his coat. The tarnished silver star caught the lamplight, and she could see that it bore the same federal authority as her father's had. I didn't come here by accident. I came here because your father's death left a case unfinished, and I was assigned to complete his work. You've been investigating me. I've been protecting you. The federal marshal's office suspected that Thomas Carraway's death wasn't accidental, and they were concerned that whoever killed him might target his daughter to prevent her from discovering evidence that could expose their operation. The admission should have made her angry, but instead she felt a strange sense of relief. Everything that had seemed too good to be true, Colt's arrival at the perfect moment, his instant connection with Stormfire, his willingness to work for wages that barely covered room and board, suddenly made sense within the context of a federal investigation. "So what now?" she asked. "Now we finish what your father started. We gather the evidence we need to shut down their operation and bring his killers to justice." "And after that?" Colt's expression grew uncertain, as if he hadn't allowed himself to think beyond the completion of his official duties. "After that, I suppose I go back to being a federal marshal. Take whatever assignment they give me next. Unless," Raina said, moving closer to him across the small office, "you found a reason to stay in one place for a while." The air between them seemed to crackle with possibility and danger in equal measure. She could see the war being fought behind his pale eyes, duty battling against desire, professional obligation struggling against personal longing. "Raina," he said, her name a whisper of warning and want. "I know what you're going to say, that it's too dangerous, that people like us don't get happy endings, that you have responsibilities that take precedence over whatever this is between us. All of that is true. But it's also true that my father spent years living a double life, hiding who he really was from the people he cared about. And look where it got him." She reached up and touched the scar that ran from his temple to his jaw, feeling him tremble at the contact. "Maybe it's time to stop pretending that duty and happiness can't coexist." Before he could respond, the sound of breaking glass shattered the intimate atmosphere of the office. Through the window, they could see flames beginning to lick at the walls of the barn, and in the orange glow of the fire, shadowy figures moved with the purposeful urgency of people carrying out a carefully planned attack. "They found us," Colt said, already moving toward the gun rack, where her father's weapons waited for hands that understood their purpose. As Raina grabbed her father's rifle and checked the loads, she realized that the revelations of the evening had changed everything and nothing. They still faced the same enemies, the same dangers, the same impossible odds. But now they faced them together, armed with truth and the kind of desperate love that made ordinary people capable of extraordinary things. The barn fire spread with unnatural speed, fed by accelerants that had been strategically placed to create maximum destruction in minimum time. Through the smoke and flames, Raina could see dark figures moving with military precision, surrounding the ranch house and cutting off escape routes with the practiced efficiency of men who had done this before. "How many?" Colt asked, checking his weapons while keeping low beneath the window line. "I count at least 6, maybe more, in the shadows." Raina's voice was steady, despite the fear that made her heart hammer against her ribs like a trapped bird. "They're not random criminals, this is organized. The attackers had chosen their timing well. Most of the ranch hands lived in the bunkhouse near the burning barn, and the smoke and confusion would prevent them from mounting any coordinated defense. Miguel's quarters were closest to the flames, and she could only pray that he and the other men had managed to escape before the fire trapped them. "We need to reach the corral," Colt said, studying the layout of buildings and cover between their position and where Stormfire waited in growing agitation. "If we can get to the horses—" His words were interrupted by the sound of splintering wood as someone kicked in the front door of the ranch house. Heavy boots echoed through rooms that had been her sanctuary just minutes before, and she heard voices calling instructions to each other with the casual brutality of professional killers. "Search every room. If they're not here, check the root cellar and the storm shelter." "What about the old man?" "What about him? We're not here to take prisoners." The casual dismissal of Miguel's life sent a surge of rage through Reyna that burned hotter than the fire consuming her barn. These men had killed her father, terrorized her community, and now they were prepared to murder innocent people to cover their tracks. Colt seemed to sense her emotional state, placing a calming hand on her shoulder as footsteps approached the office door. "We go out the window," he whispered. "Stay low, move fast, and don't stop for anything until we reach the corral." The office window opened onto the kitchen garden that her grandmother had planted decades ago, now overgrown with native plants that would provide some concealment. Colt went first, dropping silently to the ground and scanning for threats before helping her through the narrow opening. Behind them, the sound of the office door being forced open spurred them into motion. They crawled through rows of sage and wild grass toward the corral where Stormfire paced in circles, his black coat gleaming with perspiration, and his eyes rolling white with fear of the fire and smoke. Halfway to their destination, a shout from the house indicated their escape had been discovered. "They're not inside! Check the outbuildings!" Flashlight beams began sweeping the darkness, and Reyna pressed herself flat against the earth, while praying that the vegetation would hide them from searching eyes. Beside her, Colt moved with the fluid grace of a predator, every motion calculated to avoid detection while keeping them on course toward their goal. The corral gate stood open, probably kicked loose by Stormfire in his agitation. The stallion had moved to the far corner of the enclosure, as far from the flames as possible, but his intelligence was evident in the way he watched their approach. He recognized them even in the chaos, his ears pricking forward with something that might have been hope. "Easy, boy," Reyna whispered as they reached the fence. "We're getting out of here." But getting to Stormfire meant crossing 20 feet of open ground under the uncertain cover of smoke and shadows. And even if they reached him safely, riding bareback in the dark across unfamiliar terrain while being pursued by armed men would require the kind of partnership between horse and rider that few people ever achieved. "He'll carry us both," Colt said, reading her thoughts with the intuitive understanding that had developed between them. "But we'll need the special bridle, the one you made for him." Reyna's heart sank. The handmade bridle hung in the tack room of the burning barn, probably already consumed by flames or inaccessible due to smoke and heat. Without it, Stormfire would be almost impossible to guide, especially carrying double and running in panic. "Wait here," she started to say, intending to make a desperate dash for the burning building, but Colt's hand on her arm stopped her. "I'll go. You stay with him and keep him calm." Before she could protest, he was gone, melting into the smoke-filled darkness like a ghost. She watched his shadowy form approach the barn's rear entrance, where flames hadn't yet penetrated, but smoke poured out in deadly clouds. Left alone with Stormfire, Reyna found herself talking to him in the low, soothing voice she'd used during his early days at the ranch, when nightmares of the flash flood still haunted his sleep. "It's going to be all right," she murmured, though she wasn't sure she believed it herself. "Colt's coming back, and then we're going to run like the wind." The stallion seemed to understand the urgency of their situation, standing still despite his obvious fear, and allowing her to stroke his neck while they waited for Colt's return. Around them, the sounds of the search grew closer, men calling to each other, flashlight beams probing shadows, the ominous crackle of flames consuming everything her family had built. A gunshot echoed from the direction of the barn, then another, and Reyna felt her blood turn to ice water. Had Colt encountered one of the attackers? Was he injured, trapped, or worse? Minutes stretched like hours before she saw movement in the smoke near the barn's rear door. Colt emerged from the haze like a figure from a fever dream, the precious bridle clutched in one hand and a rifle taken from the tack room in the other. Blood stained his shirt sleeve, but he moved with purpose and determination that suggested the wound wasn't serious. "Company coming," he reported tersely as he reached the corral. "2 men, maybe 3 minutes behind me." The bridle slipped over Stormfire's head with the ease of long familiarity, and the stallion immediately calmed as the familiar weight and pressure told him that escape was imminent. Colt vaulted onto his back with fluid grace, then extended his hand to pull Raina up behind him. The moment she settled against his back, Stormfire launched into motion with the explosive power that had made him legendary throughout the territory. They burst from the corral like a black arrow shot from a bow, hooves thundering against hard-packed earth as they raced toward the open range beyond the ranch buildings. Behind them, shouts of anger and frustration marked their escape, followed by the sharp crack of rifle fire. Bullets whined past them in the darkness, but Stormfire's speed and the uncertain light made them difficult targets for men shooting from static positions. "Where?" Colt called over the thunder of hooves and rushing wind. "Devil's Canyon," Raina replied, her arms wrapped around his waist as they flew across terrain that she knew by heart, but he was seeing for the first time. "There's a signal fire platform on the rim if we can reach it. The whole county will know we need help." The canyon that gave the ranch its name lay 3 miles to the northwest, accessible by a trail that wound through broken country, perfect for losing pursuers, but treacherous for anyone unfamiliar with its hidden dangers. In daylight, it was a challenging ride. In darkness, with armed men following, it would require all of Stormfire's intelligence and sure-footedness to navigate safely. They reached the canyon trail as the first light of dawn began to paint the eastern sky in shades of rose and gold. Behind them, the sound of pursuing horses grew louder, suggesting their attackers had found mounts and were closing the distance with grim determination. The trail descended into Devil's Canyon through a series of switchbacks that required careful navigation, even in good conditions. Stormfire took them at a pace that would have been reckless with any other horse, his hooves finding purchase on loose rock and narrow ledges with the confidence of an animal that trusted completely in his rider's judgment. Halfway down the canyon wall, Colt suddenly pulled the stallion to a halt, his body tensing with alert awareness. "Listen," he said quietly. In the growing light, they could hear voices echoing off the canyon walls, not from above where their pursuers should be, but from below, near the bottom of the trail. Someone had anticipated their route and moved to cut off their escape. "How did they know?" Raina whispered. "Same way they knew about your father's federal connections. They've got someone on the inside, someone who knows this area as well as you do." The realization hit her like a physical blow. Marcus Wheeler had grown up on the adjacent ranch, had ridden these trails since childhood, and knew every hiding place and escape route in the surrounding country. His father's involvement in the money laundering operation suddenly took on new significance. The son might not be as innocent as they'd assumed. As if summoned by her thoughts, Marcus's voice echoed up from the canyon floor, calling her name with what sounded like genuine concern. "Raina, are you hurt? We're here to help." The "we" in his statement was revealing. Marcus Wheeler had allied himself with the men who had killed her father and burned her barn, either through coercion or willing participation in their criminal enterprise. "What do we do?" she asked, trapped between enemies above and below with nowhere left to run. Colt studied the canyon walls with the calculating gaze of someone accustomed to finding tactical advantages in impossible situations. "There," he said, pointing to a narrow ledge that seemed to lead toward a hidden crevice in the rock face. "Your father's emergency cache. He mentioned it in one of his letters." The ledge was barely wide enough for a man to walk, let alone a horse, but Stormfire responded to the pressure of Colt's knees and began picking his way across the treacherous path with the delicate precision of a dancer. Each step was calculated, each movement measured, as the stallion navigated terrain that would challenge a mountain goat. They reached the hidden crevice just as the first of their pursuers appeared on the trail above, their shouts of discovery echoing off stone walls like the baying of hunting hounds. The crevice was deeper than it appeared from a distance, opening into a natural cave that had been enlarged and fortified by someone who understood the value of secure hiding places. Inside the cave, Thomas Carraway had cached supplies for exactly this kind of emergency weapons: ammunition, food, water, and most importantly, signal flares that could be seen for miles across the high desert landscape. But the most valuable discovery was a detailed map of the entire criminal network, complete with names, locations, and financial records that would provide enough evidence to destroy the organization that had killed her father. He knew this day would come. Raina said, studying documents that her father had prepared with the methodical care of someone who understood he might not live to see justice done. He was ready for them. But he ran out of time before he could act on what he'd learned. Colt was already preparing the signal flares, positioning them near the cave entrance where they would be visible from the ranch and the surrounding area. The emergency beacon would bring help from Sheriff Davidson and anyone else who recognized the distress call, but it would also reveal their location to the men hunting them. "Once we light these, we're committed," he warned. "No more running, no more hiding. We make our stand here and trust that help arrives before our ammunition runs out." From outside the cave, Marcus's voice echoed off the canyon walls with increasing desperation. "Raina, please, I know you're in there. I just want to talk." "Talk?" Colt called back, his voice carrying the authority of federal law enforcement. "About how your father helped launder money for the Hawkins gang. About how you helped plan tonight's attack. About how you've been pressuring her to marry you so you could gain legal control of her property." The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel, and when Marcus responded, his voice had lost its pretense of concern. "You don't understand the situation, Marshal. This is bigger than one ranch, bigger than one woman's romantic notions. There are powerful interests involved, people who won't be denied what they want." Then they should have thought of that before they killed a federal officer. Thomas Carraway's death was an accident. The hell it was. Raina stepped to the cave entrance where her voice would carry clearly to the men below. "I've seen the evidence, Marcus. I know what your father was involved in, and I know you've been helping them all along. Raina, you don't know what you're saying. These people, they'll kill us both if we don't cooperate. I'm trying to save your life. By forcing me to marry you. By helping them destroy everything my father built. By finding a solution that keeps you alive and gives them what they want." The brutal honesty of his admission revealed the depth of his betrayal. Marcus Wheeler, the man who had claimed to love her, had been willing to manipulate her into marriage as part of a criminal conspiracy that had already claimed her father's life. "Light the flares," she told Colt, her voice steady with the kind of resolve that comes from finally understanding the true nature of the battle being fought. "Let everyone know we're here." The signal flares burst into brilliant light, sending columns of colored smoke spiraling up from the canyon floor toward the morning sky. The beacon would be visible for miles, a call for help that couldn't be ignored or misinterpreted. But it would also mark the beginning of the final confrontation, the moment when all the carefully maintained deceptions fell away, and the only thing left was the kind of truth that could only be settled with courage, determination, and the hope that justice might still triumph over greed and violence. As the sound of approaching hoofbeats echoed off the canyon walls from multiple directions, Raina checked her rifle and prepared to make the kind of stand her father would have been proud of, fighting for the land and the principles that had defined 3 generations of Carraway family honor. The signal flares had been burning for less than 10 minutes when the first shots rang out from the canyon rim above them. Bullets ricocheted off stone walls with the sharp whine of metal on rock, sending chips of granite flying like deadly confetti. Colt positioned himself at the cave entrance with the tactical awareness of someone who had fought from similar positions before, using the natural stone formations as cover while maintaining clear fields of fire. "They're trying to pin us down until reinforcements arrive," he observed, studying the muzzle flashes that revealed their attackers' positions. Professional approach, they know what they're doing. Below them on the canyon floor, Marcus Wheeler had taken cover behind a fallen boulder, his voice carrying up to their position with the kind of desperate reasoning that comes from watching carefully laid plans disintegrate. This doesn't have to end badly for anyone. We can work out terms that satisfy everyone involved. The only terms I'm interested in, Rayner called back, involve you and your associates in federal prison. Her response was punctuated by another volley of rifle fire from above, but the attackers were shooting blind into the cave entrance, hoping to get lucky rather than aiming at specific targets. The natural fortress that her father had chosen provided excellent protection from direct assault, but it also meant they were trapped with limited escape routes. Colt fired twice in rapid succession, and one of the muzzle flashes above them went dark, followed by a scream of pain that echoed off the canyon walls. "That evens the odds a little," he said grimly, already shifting position to avoid return fire, aimed at his location. "How long until help arrives?" Rayner asked, reloading her rifle with the practiced efficiency her father had taught her during hunting seasons that now seemed like memories from another lifetime. "Depends on how far the signal could be seen and who recognized it for what it was." Colt paused to squeeze off another shot at movement on the rim. "Could be 20 minutes, could be 2 hours. And our ammunition? Won't last 2 hours against this many opponents." The stark assessment hung between them like the smoke from their weapons, a reminder that they were fighting a delaying action rather than a battle they could hope to win through firepower alone. But the evidence cached in the cave represented more than their personal salvation. It was the key to destroying the criminal network that had operated with impunity for too long. Movement below caught Rayner's attention, and she realized that Marcus had left the shelter of his boulder and was approaching the cave entrance with his hands raised in apparent surrender. But something about his posture, the careful way he picked his footing, suggested this was a tactical maneuver rather than genuine capitulation. "He's got something planned," Colt warned, tracking Marcus's approach through his rifle sights. "No one walks into the open during a firefight unless they've got an ace up their sleeve." Marcus stopped just outside effective rifle range, close enough for conversation but far enough away to avoid being an easy target. "I've got a proposition," he called out. "Something that might interest you." "I'm listening," Rayner replied, though she kept her weapon trained on his position. "Miguel Santos is alive, but he's badly hurt. Burns from the fire. Smoke inhalation needs medical attention that he won't get if this standoff continues much longer." The news hit Rayner like a physical blow. Miguel had been more than her foreman. He'd been her father's friend, her mentor, and the closest thing to family she'd had since her parents died. The thought of him suffering while she engaged in a battle that might cost him his life made her stomach clench with agonized indecision. "How do I know you're telling the truth?" she demanded. Marcus gestured toward one of his companions, who emerged from cover long enough to drag a figure into view. Even at distance, she could recognize Miguel's distinctive profile and the way he favored his left leg from an old riding injury. The foreman was conscious but clearly in distress, his weathered face pale with pain and exhaustion. "He gets medical attention in exchange for the documents in that cave," Marcus continued. "Everyone walks away, and we pretend this night never happened. Except for my burned barn and murdered father. Accidents happen in ranch country, fires start from lightning strikes, and men die from falls off horses. The official records will reflect whatever story serves everyone's best interests." The cynical calculation in his voice revealed the depth of corruption they were fighting, a system where truth could be purchased and justice could be negotiated like any other commodity. But Miguel's suffering was real and immediate, while the abstract concept of justice offered no comfort to a man who might die without prompt medical care. "It's a trap," Colt said quietly. "The moment you step out of this cave with those documents, they'll kill all three of us and burn the evidence." "Then what do you suggest?" Before he could answer, the sound of distant gunfire echoed across the high desert, coming from the direction of the ranch buildings. Someone was engaged in combat with the main body of attackers, which meant help had arrived sooner than expected. Sheriff Davidson, Rayner breathed, recognizing the distinctive crack of the lawman's Winchester rifle. The change in tactical situation was immediately apparent to everyone in the canyon. Marcus's confident demeanor evaporated as he realized his forces were under attack from a new direction, and the men on the canyon rim began shifting their fire to cover potential retreat routes rather than maintaining their assault on the cave. "Time to go," Colt announced, already moving toward the rear of the cave where Stormfire waited with the patient intelligence that had made him such an effective partner. "We take the documents, create a diversion, and fight our way out while they're distracted." But as they prepared to mount the Stallion, a new voice echoed from the canyon entrance zone that made both of them freeze with recognition and dread. "Federal Marshal Colt Avery." The voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "This is Deputy Marshal Frank Morrison. You're surrounded and under arrest for exceeding your authority and interfering in an ongoing federal operation." The words hit like cold water thrown in their faces. Frank Morrison was Colt's superior officer, the man who had assigned him to investigate Thomas Carraway's death and complete the unfinished case. If he was here, it meant the corruption extended all the way to the federal level. "Morrison's been bought," Colt said, his voice carrying the bitter disappointment of betrayal by someone he'd trusted. "The whole federal investigation was compromised from the beginning. Then we really are on our own." "No," Colt corrected, his pale eyes blazing with determination that burned brighter than the signal flares outside. "We've got each other, we've got the truth, and we've got the best damn horse in 3 territories. Sometimes that's enough." As he swung onto Stormfire's back and pulled her up behind him, Rayner realized that this was the moment her grandmother's ring had been waiting, for not a safe choice or a practical decision, but the kind of leap of faith that separated truly living from merely surviving. The Stallion burst from the cave like black lightning, carrying them into a battle where the odds were impossible, but the cause was worth dying for, and love had finally found something more powerful than fear. Stormfire's explosive emergence from the cave caught their attackers completely off guard. The Stallion's black form seemed to materialize from shadow and stone, like something conjured from nightmare, his hooves striking sparks from granite as he launched up the narrow trail with impossible grace and power. Gunfire erupted from multiple positions, but the shooters were aiming at where they expected the horse to be, rather than where his incredible agility actually carried him. Bullets whined past them as Stormfire bounded from ledge to ledge, using his intimate knowledge of the canyon terrain to find paths that seemed too narrow or treacherous for any animal to navigate safely. "The rim!" Colt shouted over the thunder of hooves and gunfire. "We need to reach Sheriff Davidson." But as they crested the canyon wall, a new horror awaited them. The ranch buildings were indeed under siege, but not by the reinforcements they'd hoped for. Instead, a coordinated assault was underway, with federal badges gleaming on the chests of men who moved with military precision as they systematically destroyed any evidence that might implicate their criminal enterprise. Deputy Marshal Frank Morrison stood near the smoldering ruins of the barn, directing the operation with the calm authority of someone who had planned every detail in advance. The signal fire that was supposed to bring rescue had instead summoned their executioners. It was all a setup, Rayner realized, her voice barely audible over the wind rushing past as they raced across the high desert plateau. "The investigation, your assignment here, they wanted you to find the evidence so they could destroy it and eliminate the last witnesses." "Not all of it," Colt replied grimly. "Sheriff Davidson is legitimate law enforcement. If we can reach him—" His words were cut off as Stormfire suddenly veered left, his equine instincts detecting danger before human senses could process the threat. A rifle bullet carved a groove across the Stallion's neck, drawing a thin line of blood but failing to bring down the magnificent animal. Behind them, Marcus Wheeler had mounted his own horse and was leading a pursuit that included at least 4 mounted gunmen. The chase across the open desert became a deadly race between superior numbers and superior horsemanship, with Stormfire's speed and endurance providing their only advantage against overwhelming odds. "There," Rayner pointed toward a distant cluster of rocks where muzzle flashes indicated someone was engaged in combat with Morrison's federal agents. That has to be the sheriff. But reaching Davidson's position meant crossing a mile of open ground while being pursued by professional killers who had no intention of allowing them to reach safety. Worse, Morrison's men had positioned themselves between the sheriff's defensive position and any potential escape routes, creating a killing field that would be almost impossible to cross undetected. Colt made a decision that demonstrated why he had survived when so many other lawmen had died in the pursuit of justice. Instead of trying to reach the sheriff directly, he guided Stormfire toward a low ridge that would provide elevated fire positions overlooking the main battle. "What are you doing?" Rayner demanded. "Changing the odds." They reached the ridge just as Morrison's men launched their final assault on Sheriff Davidson's position. The corrupt federal marshal had clearly grown tired of the standoff and was willing to risk exposure by eliminating the last honest lawman who could testify against his criminal enterprise. From their elevated position, Colt had clear shots at the attacking federal agents, but engaging them meant revealing their location to the pursuing gunmen who were only minutes behind them. It was a tactical decision that would determine whether justice had any chance of prevailing against corruption. "The brand iron," Rayner said suddenly, remembering something from her father's hidden documents. He wrote about using the caraway brand iron as a signal, something about authentic versus counterfeit authority. She pulled the iron from Stormfire's saddlebags, where it had been carried as part of their emergency gear. But instead of being a simple branding tool, this iron bore intricate markings that identified it as an official federal sea-loan that her father had been authorized to use in his capacity as a deputy marshal. "It's not just a brand," Colt realized, studying the complex design that incorporated both the Caraway Ranch symbol and federal law enforcement authority. "It's proof of legitimacy, something that can't be counterfeited or denied." The iron represented more than legal authority. It was a symbol of the integrity that men like Thomas Caraway had brought to law enforcement, the honest dedication that stood in stark contrast to the corruption exemplified by Morrison and his criminal associates. Colt raised his rifle and began picking off Morrison's agents with the methodical precision that had made him legendary. Each shot was calculated to wound rather than kill, demonstrating a restraint that separated legitimate law enforcement from criminal violence. But his intervention came at the cost of revealing their position to the pursuing gunmen, who immediately altered course to converge on the ridge. "Now we run again," he said, helping Rayner secure the precious brand iron before remounting Stormfire. But as they prepared to flee, Sheriff Davidson's voice carried across the desert air, amplified by a speaking trumpet that projected his words with unmistakable authority. "This is Sheriff Davidson. I'm calling for all honest citizens to witness federal corruption and murder. The men wearing federal badges are criminals who have betrayed their oath and killed innocent people." The announcement changed everything. Instead of being isolated victims fighting hopeless odds, they had become part of a larger battle between law and lawlessness, justice and corruption, truth and the kind of institutional deception that had protected criminal enterprises for too long. Morrison's response was immediate and desperate. "That man is mentally disturbed and dangerous. All federal agents are authorized to use deadly force." But his words carried the hollow ring of authority without legitimacy, and even his own men seemed to recognize the moral bankruptcy of their position. Several of the supposed federal agents began to withdraw rather than continue an assault that had clearly crossed the line from law enforcement to murder. In that moment of confusion and moral awakening, Colt made his final tactical decision. Instead of fleeing, he guided Stormfire directly toward Morrison's position, betting everything on a direct confrontation that would force the corrupt federal marshal to reveal his true nature in front of witnesses. "You're insane," Rayner breathed, but she held tight as the Stallion thundered across the broken ground toward a showdown that would determine not just their fate, but the future of justice in a territory where corruption had taken root like poisonous weeds in fertile soil. As they closed the distance, Morrison raised his weapon with the desperate fury of a man whose carefully constructed deceptions were crumbling around him. And Rayner realized that sometimes the wildest thing to tame wasn't a horse or even a human heart. It was the beast of corruption that fed on fear and thrived in darkness, and could only be defeated by people brave enough to ride straight into its teeth with nothing but truth as their weapon and love as their armor. 6 months later, Rayner stood at the Declaration Stone, where it had all begun, watching the morning sun paint Devil's Spur Ranch in shades of gold and promise. The new barn rose from the foundation of the old one, built with insurance money and federal reparations that acknowledged the government's role in the corruption that had nearly destroyed her family's legacy. The freshly painted sign at the ranch entrance read, "Caraway, Avery Ranch," in letters that caught the dawn light like captured hope. The hyphenated name represented more than a marriage. It symbolized the partnership between tradition and change, between honoring the past and embracing the future. Colt emerged from the barn leading Stormfire, now wearing a bridle that bore silver conchas engraved with both the Caraway brand and the Federal Marshal's star. The Stallion had become something of a legend himself after the events in Devil's Canyon. His role in bringing down a criminal conspiracy earning him a place in the kind of stories that old-timers would tell around campfires for generations to come. "Miguel says the new colts are ready for their first saddle training," Colt reported, his voice carrying the contentment of a man who had finally found where he belonged. The scar on his face had faded to a thin silver line, but the deeper scars of his years as a federal marshal were healing through honest work and the kind of love that made daily miracles seem ordinary. Miguel Santos had survived his injuries and returned to work with the determined resilience of someone who understood the value of second chances. The smoke damage to his lungs had left him with a wheeze that became pronounced during cold weather, but his expertise with horses remained undiminished, and his quiet dignity had become a cornerstone of the ranch's renewed stability. "The federal prosecutor called yesterday," Rayner said, watching Stormfire lip grain from Colt's palm with the gentle affection that had replaced his earlier wildness. "Morrison's trial starts next month. They want us to testify about the night of the attack. The corrupt federal marshal was facing charges that would likely put him away for life, along with a dozen other officials who had been part of the money laundering conspiracy. Marcus Wheeler had cooperated with investigators in exchange for a reduced sentence, his testimony revealing the full scope of the criminal network that had used legitimate businesses as fronts for illegal activities. Harold Ashworth from the bank had been arrested attempting to flee to Mexico with suitcases full of cash that belonged to various criminal organizations. His replacement, a young woman from Denver with impeccable credentials and no ties to local corruption, had restructured Devil's Spur Ranch's debt on terms that actually made sense for a working cattle operation. "Are you ready for that?" Colt asked gently, reliving all of it again. "As long as you're there with me, I can face anything." The simple truth of the statement still amazed her sometimes. Growing up on the isolated ranch, she'd learned self-reliance as a survival skill, but she'd also learned to equate independence with isolation. Love, she was discovering, didn't make you weaker, it made you braver by giving you something worth protecting and someone worth becoming better for. They walked together toward the house that had been rebuilt and expanded to accommodate the family they hoped to create. The original structure remained at its heart, honoring the generations of Caraways who had called it home, but new additions reflected the partnership that would carry it into the future. In the kitchen, coffee was brewing in the pot that had belonged to her grandmother, filling the morning air with the rich aroma of ordinary domestic happiness. Through the windows, they could see the other ranch hands beginning their daily tasks with the easy efficiency of people who knew their work mattered and their efforts were appreciated. Tommy Rodriguez had been promoted to assistant foreman, his youthful enthusiasm tempered by the wisdom that came from witnessing courage under fire. The other hands treated him with the respect due to someone who had proven himself when it mattered most, and his confidence had grown accordingly. "I've been thinking about what you said," Raina mentioned as they sat down to breakfast at the table that now seated two instead of one, about expanding the horse training operation. And I think you're right. We've got the space, the expertise, and the reputation. People are bringing us horses from 3 states away now, wanting the Stormfire method of training. The method wasn't really a method at all. It was simply the application of patience, understanding, and respect in place of force and dominance. But the results spoke for themselves, with horses leaving Devil's Spur Ranch better trained, more responsive, and happier than they'd arrived. There's something else, she added, her hand moving unconsciously to rest on her still flat stomach. Something we should probably discuss. Colt's coffee cup stopped halfway to his lips, his pale eyes widening with understanding and hope, and the kind of joyful terror that comes with the prospect of profound responsibility. Are you? Too early to be certain, but maybe. They sat in silence for a moment, both of them processing the possibility that their partnership might soon expand to include the patter of small feet and the sound of childish laughter echoing through rooms that had been quiet too long. Boy or girl, they'll know how to sit a horse before they can walk properly, Colt finally said, and the happiness in his voice made her heart feel like it might burst with contentment. Outside the kitchen window, Stormfire grazed peacefully in the morning sunlight, his black coat gleaming like polished obsidian. The stallion had never been truly tamed. His spirit remained as wild and free as the day she'd found him trapped on that ledge during the flash flood. But he had chosen to channel that wildness into partnership rather than rebellion, much like the two humans who had found each other in the aftermath of danger and discovered that love was the most powerful force in any untamed heart. The mail arrived at 10 o'clock, delivered by a postal worker who stayed long enough to admire the new barn and share gossip from town. Among the letters and bills was an official envelope bearing the seal of the territorial governor, and Raina opened it with the mixture of curiosity and apprehension that had become her default response to governmental correspondence. "What is it?" Colt asked, noting her expression as she read. "An offer. The governor wants to appoint you as the new territorial marshal, headquartered here at Devil's Spur Ranch. Says the territory needs law enforcement officials with proven integrity and local knowledge." The offer represented vindication and opportunity, in equal measure acknowledgement that Colt's actions during the corruption investigation had demonstrated the kind of leadership the territory needed, and a chance to continue serving justice while remaining rooted in the place they'd chosen to call home. "What do you think?" he asked. "I think," Raina replied, looking out at the land that had shaped her ancestors and would shape their children, "that some storms are meant to be weathered, and some horses are meant to be ridden, and some loves are meant to last forever." As the sun climbed toward its zenith, painting Devil's Spur Ranch in the clear light of possibility, they began making plans for a future that honored the past, while embracing whatever adventures lay beyond the horizon. And in the distance, Stormfire lifted his magnificent head toward the endless sky, and whinnied with the pure joy of a creature who had finally found his place in a world that was big enough for both wildness and love, justice and mercy, tradition and transformation. Sometimes the walls we build to protect our hearts do indeed become prisons that keep love out. But sometimes, if we're very lucky and very brave, someone comes along who understands that the key to freedom isn't breaking down those walls, it's finding the courage to open the door and step into the unknown together, trusting that whatever lies ahead will be worth the risk of believing in something larger than fear. At Devil's Spur Ranch, where dust coiled like smoke and horses were bred from fire, two hearts had found their home in each other, and the legend of the woman who declared no man could break her stallion had become the true story of how love finally broke through to tame the wildest thing of all the human soul.